everyone. Welcome to the Responsive Podcast with me, Nathan Meyer, and my co-host, Josh Appel. We want to remind everyone that in this podcast, we encourage everyone to send us emails. We've been getting some feedback, and we really appreciate it. The email to reach us at is responsapodcast@gmail.com. Response is RESPONSA podcast@gmail.com. So to get started this week, we're going to talk about a number of things in the news, including the People's Conference for Palestine, which took place in Detroit. Josh, I know you wanted to talk about that. Tell us what happened there.
Thank you, and welcome back, everybody. This past weekend, there was an absolutely appalling meeting of anti-Western radicals. It was called the People's Conference for Palestine, and it took place in Detroit. So on paper, what they're doing is trying to talk about human rights and bring attention to Palestine. And so it had people such as Rashida Tlaib and Mahmoud Khalil and Linda Sarsour and Hamid Bazian, the head of SJP. It was meant to make the Palestinian cause more at the center than it already is. And what it ended up being was nothing of that sort. There was actually very little talk about human rights and very little sympathy or empathy. And really what the event devolved into, and I think this is really important, and it hasn't really gotten enough media attention. But if you want, there are clips online. If you just look up People's Conference for Palestine, you'll find things. And what it really devolved into was just tear down the West. And it was violent and absolutely vile rhetoric, talking about rising up, taking arms, using rage and anger to fight and be resistant out of spite, defense of terrorism, justification of violence, as if it's the same as standing up for bullies, comparing America to the empire that is decaying. And Rashida Tlaib said that she is the granddaughter of Palestine, meant to infiltrate Congress, and they are in the doors and cannot be stopped. This was openly revolutionary rhetoric. Since then, Lindsey Graham has sent an open letter to the FBI calling on them to investigate some of these people, because there were people talking about how we have to stop the F-35s from flying and like tampering with military equipment and rising up against certain congressmen or organizations. This was certainly incitement to violence.
I mean, you have to see some of the quotes from these people. There was a mayor from California, Eduardo Martinez, who said that he's not going to condemn Hamas because Hamas is like his childhood self lashing out at bullies. So that was an interesting comment.
Yeah.
And then there was a guy, Omar Asaf, who claimed that the Palestinian Authority, because they work with Israel in some ways, they're actually the enemy. It just goes to show how crazy these people are.
Yeah, I mean, there are people, one reporter from Palestine, Abu Bakr Abid, he said The Guardian asked him to take down a sentence in his article where he praised the resistance, meaning Hamas, if he wanted to continue writing for them, and he said no. And that was met with many cheers. Look at this guy who is standing up to the establishment, as if The Guardian is this pro-Israel establishment that needs standing up to. And it was the most radical rhetoric you could get. Again, a lot of conversation of Israel, which is a stand-in for the Jews, are controlling the media. They control the Western institutions. The West is evil. They used the Iranian moniker of Big Satan, Little Satan. They just called it the big head and the little head, and they were referring to America and Israel. This is terrorist sympathy. This is incitement to violence, and it is in Detroit, Michigan, on the shores of the American cities.
They had all these children at the program wearing keffiyehs, and they said, these children are the future of the resistance. I don't think those children were from Palestine because, you know, it's very hard for the people in Gaza to get out. So I don't know, they're probably just American kids from Detroit.
It reminded me of an interview, I think it was Dr. Oz had on Musab Hassan Youssef, who is the son of the founder of Hamas. He was talking to self-proclaimed Palestinian women who were born in America and living in Michigan, and they were in America. I think they were in I don't know which left-wing progressive university, and they were educating him on what Palestinians believe. And I just remember him going off on them and saying, you are from America. You've never been to Palestine. You've never heard of any Palestinian. You've never spoken to anybody. You are indoctrinated into this worldview as a useful idiot, and you don't know what you're talking about. It reminded me a lot of that in what you're talking about, that there are these people who have this guilt and the need to feel like they're fighting for something for some reason. Because of that, they'll cosplay and put on the costume and rage against the machine and the institutions. They really just have never experienced anything of any real
listen,
Palestine.
it's very concerning that something like this can happen in America. On the other hand, with all the news we talk about and things going on in the world, I'm not sure it's the most surprising. This is commonplace in other parts of the world, in Europe and the Middle East. The more America not only normalizes in the form of, just online anti-Semitism, but the more America just invites the world into America, so the more it invites the prejudices and hatreds of the entire world. Ultimately, are we so surprised by this? I can't say that I am.
I agree with you. And it reminded me, just looking at the clips, whoever set it up did a really bad job. It was a very dark room with a dark background and a very high ceiling. And it kind of reminded me of the Bund, the Nazi party in America in the 1930s, and their rally at MSG, which was also very cultish language. Stand up, join me in this fight for something greater than yourself.
But that's the point. I mean, I don't think that they like it. I think that's the move they're going for.
Yeah, I think they want to feel like they're part of this revolution. This is really what I think is most important. Of course, this is certainly anti-Semitic. I'm not one to just throw out that accusation. This is just anti-Semitic, scary Jew hatred type thinking. But it also is anti-Westernism and this belief that the West is inherently evil and responsible for all the evils in the world. And because of that, it needs to be dismantled and destroyed through resistance. And resistance in their heads is not meant to be peaceful. I mean, Said and Fanon type thinking is resistance is justified. And if it's violent, that's part of it. I think Said is quoted as saying, "What did you think resistance looked like?" And you saw people throwing around that quote after October 7th, that when you have injustices, when you have occupation and colonialism, you can't then demand the white supremacist peace, which is a social construct of whiteness to be peaceful and moral, that this is what you, by being white, have done this to them and caused them to be violent, and they don't have to succumb to your vision of what it means to be a good person. And that is kind of like what we're seeing here. The legacy of postmodernism mixed together with sort of the Marxist thinking of this people on top and people on the bottom, or oppressor and oppressed. And when you put those two together, you get this dangerous stew of, number one, feeling that people who are wronged, who need to rise up against people who have done the evil, and then also the idea that ultimately moral relativism is an okay thing, and that truth is subjective and morality is in the eye of the beholder. Those two ideas together are very dangerous. And I think what we're seeing here, like you said, it's not surprising at all.
But I think you're making a great point, Josh, that we see the influence of these different ideologies in strange ways, because these were, at heart, this was basically an Islamist event, right? It took place in Detroit. Most of the participants were Muslim, and there was obviously a Muslim sort of overlay, support for Hamas. That was the groundwork, if you will. And then, like you say, this is happening in America, where we have a lot of left-wing politicians. So there's this postmodern, I guess, overlay and this postmodern view that there's no such thing as violence. I actually think that when you look at what happened at this event, it's much more the Islamist element won out. Because whilst there may not have been a prayer service, at the end of the day, the central focus was this sort of religious, ethnic element to it. And I think the daring philosophical elements of leftism, which seeks to justify the most extreme of Palestinian resistance or any type of resistance against the West, that sort of philosophical flush was not as present. What was much more going on was just sort of like, this is who we are. We are Hamas, and we celebrate this. Hamas is normal. And that was that sort of ethnic, even a populist element to it all.
I agree with you. And I think that what struck me the most was there was very little talk about actual peace. There was no policy about peace, or BDS was not brought up as a way to pressure Israel to capitulating to peace. It was, we have to
Just
make
expression of
Israel,
anger.
we have to erase Israel and just totally wipe them off the map. That
Right. I
is that
think
they are the stand-in for the West.
right, and I think that you can even add to that, which is that, as we've talked about in the Middle East, Palestine is this symbol of the lost glory of the Arab Muslim world. And I think that was echoed here. The anger from those who believe that their lost glory has been taken from them. And that was, I think, the strongest strain at this conference, just anger, not any particular sort of philosophical. Again, these people, I'm not even sure these people are so intelligent to know the difference between Frantz Fanon and John Paul Sartre or something.
What's interesting is that there were a lot of professors at this event. And so
Mhm.
I agree with you. I think there's two things. That number one, I don't think there is a lot of, let's say, reading being done, but I think there's a lot of indoctrination being done in Middle Eastern studies department and cultural studies. And I mean, they have colonial studies departments in very prominent universities, and these teachers are very often peddling the most radical theories imaginable. There's actually a database you could go on. If you look up curriculum database, you could find this pretty easily, and you could see keywords that show up on different curriculums across the United States. It has very good filters and tags so that you could look at different parts of the United States, different universities, and some of the most common names on syllabi across the United States after the 101 classes. So, whoever wrote the textbook for Stats 101, basically number 2 and number 3 are Edward Said and Frantz Fanon. And that is and then number 4 or 5, I think, is Karl Marx. So these are, to me, very frightening, and they speak a lot to how the university has really done a effective job at indoctrinating the populace into this belief that has come from, and here's where I disagree. I think it has come from a lot of the Islamic world, but it has been transplanted and thus morphed in the West. It's not like these people are trying to become Muslim, although there is a frightening trend online of these very white TikTok liberal progressive Starbucks types who have become enamored by
The latte,
Muslim,
the
like
Muslim latte,
traditional
the halal
Muslim.
latte.
It's really crazy. These girls who look normal, regular, and they're talking about it's good for a man to beat his wife and be in charge of her and to do these traditional Islamic things from the Crusade era. It's really like, I was blown away that this is a crazy trend. There is an imported Islamist sense, and I think it's true more especially in Europe, where there are a lot more Islamic immigrants or Arab immigrants. That's why Sweden and France have made burqa laws a standard practice. But in America, what has happened is it's not just a love for Islamic ideology or wanting to become Muslim. They see a kindred spirit in the resistance for Palestine. And it's more than just intersectionality. They truly want to tear down the West. They believe that the West has been a source of all the world's evils because they are utopianistic thinkers. They think the world could be perfect. And any discrepancy, any inefficiency, any disparate outcome is therefore evidence of evil instead of just the natural world where not everything is going to be perfect and human nature. Because of that, they want to tear down the West, but you can't tear down the West. It's not possible. We have very strong institutions and political parties that are dynamic and lots of people with different ideas. But there's a young fledgling country that is in a hostile area that represents a lot of the Western world that, again, I don't think so, but theoretically could be torn down, could be hollowed out, and that is Israel. And so what I think they see in the fight for Israel is the proxy of the idea that we could tear down the West and be successful. And if Israel falls, it's as if the Native Americans are taking back America. That's the idea subconsciously and sometimes overtly. And so for them, they'll put on the keffiyeh pretending to care about human rights and justice, but really, when they come to the conference, it's, I just want Israel to be wiped off the map so that could make me happy and believe that the West has lost and hasn't taken over the world with its colonialism and imperialism and
Right.
racism.
And I think that this Listen, it's again, like I said, it's shocking, but ultimately not
It connects
surprising.
very much
Uh,
to something else that happened
right,
this week,
right,
actually.
which is that because one of the speakers at this event was Hasan Piker. Hasan Piker is a 34-year-old YouTube streamer. He streams videos of him playing video games. This is a very popular thing on YouTube. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done that for a living. I just play a video game and talk about things all day.
I mean, these people become famous.
Yeah,
What's so fascinating about fame in America is once you become a certain level of fame and you reach that strata, you could become political
right.
activist
I mean, I
or
think he was
voice.
always providing political commentary in his videos. He's basically a left-wing streamer. Hasan Piker is actually the nephew, I believe,
He's a nephew of Cenk Uygur.
of Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks, and he's like basically a leftist streamer, and what's very unique about him is that he is able to attract young males to his left-wing stream, which is obviously the left is desperate to get young
Yeah.
males to their to their side. And
Yeah.
he's
Well,
also
the New York Times put out a very nice article about him months ago that he's
right,
basically the left wing Joe Rogan. On the right wing, you have this bro culture. They're strong, muscular. They don't care about being PC. They use slang. They smoke, drink,
right.
and live in wooden cabins. They're just kind of cool guys. And that's what Tucker is trying to cosplay, but that's the Joe Rogan aesthetic. And they wear t-shirts with their bulging biceps and they're cool.
But they're
The
also
left wing
just
problem was always that
believe whatever stupid thing they read. So
yeah. The New York Times basically likened him to like he's just this left wing Joe Rogan, like such a
right,
nice,
a heavy
fashionable.
dose of basically, he basically said on his stream, it doesn't matter if rape happened on October 7, all resistance is justified. He said that Orthodox Jews are inbred and
This
pigs.
pigs.
He's called a Jew a pig. Like, I mean, this is a full blast.
He brought a Hezbollah fighter, I think, on his show. He waves Hezbollah flags. He laughs and cackles at these videos of terrorists committing acts of terror. He's a terrible human being, but
Right.
also just a terrorist sympathizer. And Twitch has not taken him down. He's their most popular streamer.
Right. And he's now being invited by the New Yorker to a discussion about online influencers and how the internet affects the future of democracy. He's going to be there with another right-wing populist pundit named Sagar Enjeti, who hosts Breaking Points. And I think what's interesting when you see this is, first of all, you see that, political commentary just increasingly is just getting, we now have to, like it was one thing for in the 60s university professors to cow to their student mobs. Now we're not even cowing to college student mobs. We're just cowing to kids on the internet. This guy on the internet, he's playing Call of Duty or something, and he has what to say about the world. So let's invite him on because a lot of people think it's interesting what he's saying. When you read stories like this, it makes you realize that Plato was very right in the Republic when he said democracy just eats itself.
Wow, you're such
The
a
reason,
you're such a Straussian scholar. I didn't.
no, and well, my point, which is that we see the Breaking Points, right, which is this show. I believe it was offshoot of the Young Turks. Am I
Yeah, I
correct?
think so.
Okay, it's an offshoot, right?
Very
So, right, a very
Al
anti-Israel.
Jazeera
I know
carve
that
out.
it's a number of people who used to not be so anti-Israel, now they are. You just see that all they are is, oh, this is a popular topic, so let's talk about it. You could give the benefit of the doubt to things like Fox News and the mainstream media. They also just grab on to what's a popular topic, but you could at least praise them for trying to normalize that and make it a bit more sensible and add a bit of parameters to those discussions. But increasingly, we see in this internet world that people will just jump on what is popular. This kid over here, he's saying crazy things about the Jews. That's probably pretty popular. Let's invite him on. There's no this is the New Yorker. The New Yorker is supposed to be a respectable publication for, but ultimately democracy. I mean, Chesterton said, right? He said democracy, he said aristocracy is the rule by the badly educated, but democracy is the rule by the uneducated. And I think that the New Yorker, which is supposed to be this educated outlet, doesn't see its role in bringing substance to the conversation. I guess I want to just connect this to that conversation we once had about Aristopopulism and the problem we have in the elites here, which is, Hasan Piker, I guess you could say he is now an elite. He's a millionaire and he lives a very nice life. The point is the mainstreaming of someone like Hasan Piker by the New York Times, by the New Yorker, what it really is the elites in society resigning their position. The role of the elites is to
to be the guardrails of
right,
society.
to be the guardrail. And increasingly, the elites just have sort of abandoned that position. I suppose that has happened completely on the right with Donald Trump. You could argue Donald Trump's victory was the takeover. But in many ways, when people see the elites doing such a bad job, it's no wonder that they then turn away.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's very disappointing.
I think that is ultimately the legacy of social media. It has had some good, but overall, what it has done is allowed mob rule to take over and the mentality of that. And so, what that means is that the guardrails of society, the elites, the historians, the people with doctorates who could tell us what is right and what is wrong, have relinquished that control to the need to be liked on social media. The idea that social media has created a culture where being part of wherever the ideological winds are that day is more important to people, especially for people in the public eye and public sphere. They don't want to say the wrong thing, and that thing is, again, it's determined more by whatever's trending on Twitter that day, whatever's considered in vogue. And so the culture is now, like you said, where the New Yorker will invite Hasan Piker, and it's just crazy. And I mean, Zoran Mamdani did a sit down interview with this guy, and there's just nothing. Even if you want to say Palestinians deserve better and Israel is destroying their lives and there's a genocide, which is, again, I think a farce, but if you want to make that claim, that's one thing. But to sit down with this man who's clearly evil is like sitting down with Charles Lindbergh during World War II. I don't see
No, but I mean, why should someone who plays Call of Duty, why he has what? So I mean, I guess he's got more to say about the world than someone who's actually was in a real Call of Duty.
right. And I think this is what we saw during COVID, where this, I think, really broke out, where social media was really able to expose the elites. I mean, a lot of the problem is also that the elites have become institutionally captured and ideologically flattened to only have certain narrow beliefs. Because of that, they've had to take crazy positions on a lot of different things. And because of that expose of their own credentials not leading to actual wisdom, that has given this hole for this gap where social media could kind of fill in. And that is what people ultimately are very happy about. That, look, now after COVID, you don't need to be an expert to have an opinion anymore. And if you're an expert, that should make you suspect. That's actually a bad thing. And
Right.
I mean, that was the Joe Rogan, Douglas Murray, and Dave Smith debate. Was like, Douglas Murray came out of the gate swinging. He said, "You're not an expert, you're a comedian." And Dave Smith said, "I don't care. What do you mean? I don't need to be an expert. All I need to do is read a book or two. I don't need to go to the region. I don't need to have studied it in some sort of pedagogical
I mean,
way."
I think it's interesting because we also had the news this week of this International Society of Genocide Scholars that decided that Israel was committing a genocide. But it's to your point, was this really such a society of genocide scholars just to pay $30 to be in it?
Right.
So,
Just to clarify, what happened was that these reports started coming out that this week, finally, this organization, the International Genocide Scholars, decided it's finally a genocide. Every news outlet ran with this. Then it turned out that all it takes to become part of this elite class of genocide scholars is you just have to pay a certain fee. It became a meme. Like, people started signing up as Cookie Monster and,
right,
and
right.
you know,
But
Darth
also,
Vader.
it was only like 30% of the whole society actually
Exactly.
took part in the vote. More importantly, it shows that the elite institutions have been hollowed out. Clearly, this is a meaningless sort of society, and it's not really representing anything important. I want to touch on another event in the anti-Semitism world, which was at a Coldplay concert. I'm not sure where this Coldplay concert was, but Chris Martin, the main singer, pulled someone from the audience, and he said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Israel." And he said, "Oh, we accept everyone, I think."
Well,
We
so
also want
people started booing
right. People started booing. Okay,
just from being from Israel. Started
right. They
booing.
started booing, and he said, "I think we welcome everyone here." And he said, "We also want to welcome people from Palestine."
Right.
Chris Martin has historically supported Palestine in the past. I'm not even surprised. It's very upsetting. If anyone would be there from India, they say, "Oh, you're from India. We also want to welcome people from Pakistan." No, that wouldn't happen.
Right. It reminds me of when, until Trump came into office, the rhetoric from universities or any institution that wanted to talk about anti-Semitism is, we have to stand up to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of hate.
Right.
It's like, well, what? You don't say like I thought all
Ableism,
lives racist. I
Right.
thought all lives matter was racist because you're
Right.
dehumanizing the cause of the black people. But with Israel, it's totally okay to say your humanity is contingent on the recognition of the Palestinian people. And why do you have to speak out of both sides of your mouth? Just bring them on stage, say they're human, period. They don't have to
Right.
only be human because there are Palestinians in the audience. And to connect those things, I think, is quite evil. That if not for recognition of the Palestinians, the Israelis actually would not warrant being cheered on stage. It should
To
be
put a
booed.
more philosophical spin on this, you could argue that the recognition of Jewish identity for these left-wing populists is very problematic because Judaism today, or the state of Israel, represents a last vestige of nationalism, a particular people standing up for their history, beliefs, and way of life in rejection of the humanist globalist project, the humanist globalist, you know, movement. And so if we want to recognize this Israeli here, it's only because we're also recognizing a Palestinian. You can't have this particular Jew. You have to have the universalist Jew, the Jew who's also friendly with a Palestinian and, who sucks up to him. I think that, we see that sort of perfectly crystallized in this moment that the Jew's
Yeah.
identity, his identity needs to be that he's Jew Palestinian. He's not
Right.
Jew
And
alone.
I think you're making a great point because we have seen a resurgence in this debate that really started with, I mean, there are moments, let's say, in the Torah, but ultimately the debate took place when Christianity came into being. And the idea that the Jews are too particular and not universal enough, and Jesus is for everybody. That resulted in many Jews being killed over many years in Europe. But that kind of
Right.
narrative was
I mean,
put
I
to
think
bed in
I
America, and
want
now
to
it's resurging
right.
in
I think
droves.
I would agree with you that there definitely is a universalist element in Christianity, but what we're seeing is the change to the historical descendant of that concept, which has transmorphed into, John Lennon sort of global humanitarianism, which sort of
Right.
views that wants to just, and the religious element has been put aside. There's no religious element anymore. There's no Jesus anymore. It's just we are all here. We accept you so long as you put your particular beliefs, your personal family commitments aside and come join the blob.
Yeah.
Right.
I wrote an article on this for National Review last week about how Jews in the media, think of any movie or TV show that has portrayed Jews, it has always been in this sort of rejection of particularism.
Right.
And that what makes Judaism is it's just immigrant culture. So you have random foods and you might have some themes and accents that are Jewish, but within a couple of generations that gets washed out and you just totally assimilate into the universal human race and you join everybody in holy matrimony.
Right. I want to plug Josh's piece. The long short story shortchanges the American Jewish experience in National Review.
Long story short.
Long story short changes the American Jewish experience, which is a Netflix show, and Josh gave a smash a great review where he basically tore the show to shreds.
I don't know if anyone watched the show. It happens to be I like the show as a show, but
Josh,
as
you are a big movie critic. Maybe we should
yeah.
discuss that more on the podcast. That Josh is
Yeah,
actually
I do.
a movie.
I think I am a big believer in culture is generally the driver of a lot of politics. I think the way it's colloquially referred
that's
to
why
as
Call of Duty streamers are more important than
yeah. I mean, culture again, as
William
many
F.
put it,
Buckley.
culture is downstream from politics, and the way things are portrayed in movies and TV shows and music is oftentimes a much better marker than what a politician says. And I think a lot of times the politicians, and especially I think to put it together in this world of social media, we're describing where the mob is in charge, right? So it used to be you might have your opinion and you don't know what other people think besides those at your kitchen table who might agree or disagree with you. Now everybody knows what everybody thinks. So there's ironically, instead of greater diversity, there's a greater need to feel like you fit in to whatever everybody else is saying. And so I think politicians now take their lead a lot. And this has always been the case, but I think even more so now, it's obvious that they take the lead from what people are saying and what will therefore make them popular. And again,
Right.
this is not a new idea that politicians are ultimately trying to get votes. I mean, the founding fathers knew that. That's why they wanted the Senate to and the House to operate in different ways. The Senate was meant to be more dignified and that you don't have to worry about getting votes. Of course, how that has not come to be, but of course, everybody I think was aware that politics were for people who didn't always have ideological priors and were just trying to get votes. But
Mm.
I think it's so much more true now, where everybody has to capitulate to a certain way of thinking, which is what's so funny about all the right wing people online who they again they made their legacy during COVID on this idea that Fauci is shutting us down and we're not allowed to ask questions. And what they have done is basically taken that idea of we're open, we're ideologically not captured, and we'll believe alternative theories for things. And but then they have done the exact thing that they said and shut down anybody who disagrees with them and gone after dissidents to their belief. And that is, again, I think inevitably what happens with social media
Well,
is
you
like,
just see for them, the parameters of the debate are basically what gets clicks, and asking certain questions get clicks, but other questions not as interesting. So it doesn't get as many clicks. So let's not talk about it.
right. But I think
You know,
also there's a psychological thing, which is like, if you used to have an opinion before social media, you would share that with people and you might feel some social pressures to believe a certain thing. But how many people were you sharing that opinion with who were going to disagree with you? Probably not that many. But now, how many people did you even know their opinion on the topic? Let's say, meaning, let's take an example, gun rights. How many people before you developed your theory on gun rights did you know their opinion in your personal life? Very few, right? You might have seen an
right,
article or two or something like that, and you developed your opinion more organically and tested it out at a mixer event or something, and you kind of shaped
right,
your
yeah.
it was more organic. I'm not saying that nobody before social media was ever pressured into certain ways of thinking. I think there were, and college campuses were for sure like that. There were always workplace norms and conformities that were taking place, and there's always this sort of group mob mentality that happens in life because humans are instinctively very tribal. That's our human nature.
But now it's sort of on a global scale.
Exactly. And
That's
now
an
it's like,
interesting point.
I mean, it's the CNN effect, but more that everything happening now is acutely aware to you at all time.
It's very
And
hard to preserve a personal
exactly.
area to nurture your own genuine and subtle beliefs about something without getting wrapped into general
Exactly.
views.
Exactly. And that's why, I mean, it's no coincidence that has created more of a rapture and divide in our politics, and it's reactionary, right? Trump does this, everybody therefore has to take the furthest opposite view of what is the correct thing. Because of that, I think
I
a
think
lot of
you're
these,
making a very astute point about the globalization of peer pressure, basically, is what you're trying to
exactly.
say.
Meaning, to connect it to this, I don't think, I mean, I know, like you said, Chris Martin was probably always a Palestinian supporter, but the fact that he felt the need to do that shows you that he knows where
He's
he,
subject to this peer pressure,
yeah, like he knows that this clip is going on social media, and that if he just recognizes Israelis as Israelis and human beings, that's a bad thing. And that's
Right.
not,
He's gonna be some,
the
yeah.
thought police are going to get you in a lot of trouble for that.
Right. You have to sort of check the box that don't worry, I follow the
Exactly.
peer pressure that yes, I also want to welcome the Palestinians.
Exactly. Like, let's say before the age of social media, let's say he had done something that the left wing populists didn't agree with. So maybe he gets a newspaper article that a few people read, but is it going to ruin his career and make him outside of the ideological pure class? Like, no, if he doesn't recognize Palestinians, it's not that big a deal. But now social media has created this effect where everything is always acutely aware to us that, number one, it impacts the way you make decisions, and then it impacts the way people judge things that happen in real life. And it's a very, I don't know the answer. I mean, for anyone who's interested, Thomas Chatterton Williams just put out a book called The Summer of Our Discontent. And it deals with what we're talking about, the guardrails being broken and society descending into this chaotic back and forth of reactionary. And you have George Floyd and January 6th, and it's just back and forth of crazed politics. A lot of it he connects to social media and the idea of during COVID being stuck at home and that was your only outlet made things so much worse. I think it's basically a case study in what
It's
has
funny because
happened
you
to
could
us.
argue that being at home, you had to at least have a relationship with people that were around you. Now you can go to this crazy conference and
Right.
see, not only do I see that on YouTube everyone agrees with this, but I see the people in person. Here they are. We all know how to get together and energize ourselves, as opposed to this is what's going on the internet. Sometimes you have to confront a human person, and it's like they're not necessarily plugged into your stratosphere of Twitter or YouTube. Now you can stay in that stratosphere even in your daily life by
This
finding
is
these
something
people.
Christine Rosen, who wrote a book about the digital age and this sort of phenomenon. I know she talks about how the promise of the internet was you're going to have more diversity of thought. That
Right.
now you, who has only existed in New York, is going to get the opinion of somebody in China that you've never heard before. But what happened is you ended up rerouting yourself in whatever your prior ideas were by finding a community that already agreed with you, and that only strengthened your prior commitments to whatever you believe. And it creates dangerous communities around very dangerous ideas that become reinforced instead of rejected.
Right. I think we should move on. We'll discuss a few quick topics in the news. First of all, a really quick thought on DC, which has decided to sue Trump. DC is basically suing Trump based on what's called the Home Rule Act, which was an act passed in the after sort of the civil rights movement. DC, which used to basically not, it was not, there was no representation there, right? There was no, it didn't, it was just basically run by Congress. So the Home Rule Act gave some level of representation to the District of Columbia. Within that act, it took away some of the powers from Congress to run DC and gave them to an elected mayor. Within that act, there is residual power that remains to Congress and also to the president. Most importantly, Section 740, which basically says the president can take emergency control of the police. And that's basically the subject of this lawsuit, which is that Trump sent a lot of the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. into Washington, into District of Columbia, and he went on this. A lot of people were arrested and deported, and obviously the mayor of DC is very upset about that. And the mayor is arguing that yes, the president can take emergency control of the police, and it says that when the president feels there's an emergency, he can ask the mayor to provide him police services, and the mayor shall provide those services. So it's pretty clear that if Trump wants an emergency, wants the police, he'll get it. But the mayor's argument against Trump is that what Trump did, Pam Bondi's order was not just to take control of the police, it was to restructure the leadership of the police and set Trump's people as the leaders. And that was very upset. It says, okay, it's one thing to hire the police, but you can't restructure the leadership. And that's the source of this dispute. I will just set my 2 cents. If you read Section 740, apart from the section saying that the mayor shall provide, when the president deems there to be an emergency, the mayor shall provide these police services. First of all, the name of that section is emergency control of the police. So it's not just that the president asks the police to do him a favor. He takes control. So Trump and Pam Bondi are restructuring the leadership of the Washington, D.C. Police Department. That's the whole point. They can take control of it. And another legal argument discussed was that when you have, let's say, someone who enlists someone else, right, or in a military context, right, when a general will enlist soldiers to be his mercenaries, so or a king enlists mercenaries. So the king doesn't enlist them to be his soldiers. He doesn't enlist them to tell their general what to do, and then the general will figure it out. He's their general now. That's what happened here. Meaning Trump enlisted this police. I know I'm using this medieval metaphor because Trump is like a medieval king, but that's the point. Trump enlisted this police, and he didn't enlist that, I'm going to tell your boss what to do. That's the whole point of the order. The point of the order is that the city of Washington, D.C. will provide police officers to the president at his order. So there are a few other legal arguments. They were suggesting there's a breach of the separation of powers. But I just want to say that Washington, D.C. was always a historically unique, artificially built city. I think when you go there, you kind of see it's basically a government city. There's no economy apart from the government. And it was this unique area chosen to satisfy the South. And when you study the founding of America, why was Washington, D.C. put closer to Virginia? And so, the whole idea that, of course, we want people in DC to have representation, but this is the city of the government and not exactly the city of the people there. I think it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah. So we'll have to see what happens. Trump, it seems like every week he makes a lot of moves. People have spoken about how that is his sort of political strategy to flood the news cycle. The more information there is to report on, the less things get focused on. There's only one thing to focus on, that becomes a very easy point of attack. Like you said, the more there is, you spread out all the attacks and it kind of dilutes everything. And so, we spent the whole episode last week with about 6 or 7 different things he's done. So we'll have to see. But I think what is interesting that often goes under the radar on your point is, for all the people talking about the end of democracy and things like that, Trump is doing everything legally. These are legal proceedings within the confines of
The court.
democracy. Again,
Yeah.
this is not the Reichstag fire and giving emergency chancellor powers to anybody. This is the president certainly expanding
Uh,
executive power,
No,
but that
no
is
journalists have been, there's been no extortion. No journalists have been attacked. You know,
exactly. And again,
Uh,
and even still, I mean, we have the Alien and Sedition Acts, and there's always like, this sort of executive power there is overreach of executive power, and that is the job of the law and the other branches of government to quell that power. That is the point of checks and balances. Sometimes we forget that the point of checks and balances is that it is very natural for one branch of a government, whether it's the parliament or the monarch, to believe that they are all powerful. And the point is not that you should have a government where, I mean, listen, in an ideal world, everyone would not overstep their boundaries. But the genius of the founding fathers is that they believed in the inevitability of human nature and that people would overstep their boundaries. And that is the point of checks and balances, that they will be a check and a balance on the overstepping of boundaries. And if they're not oversteps of boundaries, then there's nothing to be worried about. So I think that it just shows you the genius of the founding fathers and the foresight that they had to understand that this would happen, and that you can't just rely on the goodwill of people to follow legal precedent, because there will always be people who could bend the law to fit their needs or do things that they see fit that may technically fit the law or even go against the law, but they feel that it's justified. And again, I'm not saying I defend all of Trump's moves and he's the greatest president who ever lived and everything is everyone else's fault. I think there are things here that he's doing that are breaking the norm, and some things I'm really unhappy with. We'll see what the Supreme Court says. We'll see what Congress could do, and hopefully they'll be able to come to this sort of middle ground where all the things that are happening are restored to the way that they need to be. That might be in Trump's favor, and it might not be, but it will be through the conduit of democracy ultimately, which I think is an important point to make.
Right. I think we should move through a few other topics. The United States is potentially denying a visa to Mahmoud Abbas, who's going to come speak at the UN General Assembly, which is a big deal because, of course, the whole world is recognizing, or the whole world, don't need to say it's not the whole world, but a lot of European countries are recognizing a Palestinian state, and I suspect that at the UN General Assembly, that's going to be a big deal. But the United States is now denying him and actually a lot of people from the Palestinian Authority a visa to come. And I'll say just about that it also reflects the irrelevance of the UN, in the sense that the UN is really not an American institution. It's an anti-American institution. It's basically a force of the third world, really. The third world
Yeah,
is
no,
what
it's
monopolizes the UN. And I used to, my father used to say that the UN should really be in China, because it really serves much more it's basically a place for people to get up and smash the American president and whatever the United States is doing. And finally, the Americans have said, this thing is in New York City, so we have sovereignty. So they're going to take advantage of that. And if the UN wants, they can move to China or Doha in Qatar. That might be a better location. And we'll expose the UN for what it really is. It's not some global institution where all the countries of the world come together. It's just a place where people get up and bash the West.
Turkey is the one talking about human rights violations while they're occupying Cyprus and murdering people all over the regime and running an autocratic empire and totalitarian state and Islamic outposts. So it's totally the inversion of what I think the legacy of Woodrow Wilson was in his head supposed to be.
Glad the United States is finally sort of exercising its abilities to do something about this, as opposed to, just silently like, oh, well, that's the UN. We can't touch
Right,
it.
I
It's a legacy
agree.
institution. It was made after World War II. We can't say anything about it. This is a holy cow that is no longer a holy cow.
I agree. It's never really done anything great besides ratify the state of Israel. And it's not just because I'm a supporter of Israel. I just really can't think of anything else that it's done that has even been intellectually serious, let alone good for the world. But even just
Uh,
what have they ever done that was taken seriously by other
Support the
countries?
Korean War.
Right, exactly.
Any imperialist American invasion that they supported was probably the greatest thing that they ever did. I
Yeah,
think
but
they
how did those go? I think what we forget and is very important to remember is just look at a map. The United States exists in its own sphere, and it's a small percentage of the world's order of regimes. We forget how big the East is. Russia, China, these are massive. And then you have the entire Arab Islamic world. These are massive areas, and Africa and all of these areas that don't want what Woodrow Wilson wanted. In Woodrow Wilson's head, who, of course, he made the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations, but is essentially under the same ideology, is that the West is gonna. I mean, and I think even George Bush fell prey to this ideology that the West will ultimately sweep across the world in sort of this global version of manifest destiny, but it's wishful thinking, and that we are the majority and that the evil states are the minority, and it's really the opposite. And for that reason, basically the UN, like you said, has become a screaming match against the United States with this performative resistance on
Mm.
part of the
If
United
anything,
States and Israel, but none
it's
of it means
it's
anything.
it's an opportunity for the third world to inflict their colonialism on the West, to
Exactly.
come and tell us why everything they do is wrong.
No, but if you're brown skinned, you can't be imperialist or colonial.
Right.
The Islamic world is
There
not.
was no empire there.
There was no empire. There was no
No.
colonialism from
Empire
Saudi
was
Arabia.
not an empire.
Yeah,
definitely not.
exactly. Like, don't look at a map before 600 and then
Yeah, just
afterward. Don't look at the changes, because
They
I'm
don't
sorry
want
to say, it kind of
Mongolia
rejects
never
all,
conquered anything.
for sure.
For
Definitely
sure,
not.
they didn't.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
So I think that's also a great move by Trump. And I mean, a lot of these, there's a lot of other moves by Trump this week. RFK is in the hot water, and he went to Capitol Hill. We'll have to see what happens with that. I don't have much to say, although I'm very opposed to his anti-vaccine rhetoric, and he's not a doctor. I don't know. This is kind of bad Trump operating under the Godfather model. RFK helped him out, got him some votes, campaigned for him, dropped out of the election to get more votes for Trump, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Got him a nice cushy job, and this man is. It's not just that he's not qualified. I don't care about that if you do a good job, but he's just saying things that are so anti-scientific, and it's actually affecting reality. I mean, Florida passed or is trying to pass legislation to ban vaccine mandates across the board in schools, and they cited in law, God made your body, no one should tell you what to put in it, and that's not a good thing. I mean,
Hasidic school.
vaccine. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, vaccine mandates have been a good thing for health across the United States.
But the point is that when things are abused, this is the reaction that happens.
Exactly. A
And
lot of
when
this,
there was the
it goes
COVID
back
vaccine
to
abuse,
exactly.
you now let the cat out of the bag of this. It's
Exactly. It goes back to what we were talking about with social media. A lot of the fault is on the elites who discredited themselves and left the hole open for Dave Smith and Cenk Uygur to come in and say, no, 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 no. We're the smart people. Like, Tim Dillon is the smart guy now, and Joe Rogan knows how to cure stuff and live life now. And Andrew Tate is the modern psychologist that will save you through his amazing ideas of how to live. Don't listen to those terrible experts like Jordan Peterson, who's also right wing, by the way, which is so funny. They hate him because he's a doctor and he studied books and read things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of just the like I said, the credentials haven't led to wisdom, and the institutions themselves were hollowed out by ideology. This is why ideology should never subvert science, and you should never try to fit science into an ideology. And that's what a lot of repressive regimes have done over time. There's a famous case I always like to quote. There was a botanist in Soviet Russia. His name was Trofim Lysenko, and his idea was that Mendelian genes were Western, because it was the idea that the strong prevailed. And so his idea was to, I don't know all the science behind it, but to basically have it so that he tried to create a scientific outcome where the weaker plants would be the ones that prevailed. And he proposed that even in harsh conditions in winter, you could plant these peas, and it ended up being what Stalin loved, because this is Soviet science. It conforms with the ideas of Marx and communism and Trotsky, as even though Stalin didn't like Trotsky that much, but it conforms to those ideas. And so he got rid of all of these scientists who were warning that this is going to be a massive problem and this is not science, this is pseudoscience. But because it fit a certain ideology, he went with it and he hollowed out the institutions. And those were what ultimately created the massive famine and starvations that killed millions of people in Russia. It was atrocious. It's a very bad trend when you see that. And we're seeing the reaction to that now. The idea that a man could become a woman, which was so popular in the scientific fields, even though it was not supported by data, but you could make the data that would fit that prior agenda. And now, I mean, Joe Biden made his head of HHS a transgender man. So this is what you get.
Right. The instrumentalization of science, it's a hollowing out of the elite institutions. And now we have people who don't have any credentials at all running them.
Yeah. I mean, that's how you get Donald Trump too, by the way.
Right.
And social media comes in and it kind of fills the gap and ruins things and it makes things reactionary and polarized. And I think that's a lot of the theme here that is taking place.
Yeah. I think before we end, we should just talk about two last topics. One is just the court, which is now the Supreme Court is going to consider Trump's tariffs, because tariffs are a congressional power of the legislative branch.
And a lower level court struck them down this week.
Right,
So
struck
now
down
he's
the
appealing
tariffs.
to the Supreme Court.
This would not be good for American foreign policy, which she may have a point about. We have to see further what the court will say, because there have been bills that delegated some of Congress's power over tariffs into the president's hand. And especially if you view tariffs as a form of foreign policy, which they are in many ways, then foreign policy is traditionally viewed as the president's power. So, where do tariffs exactly sign? If tariffs are a tax, then they're probably more in the Congress's hand. If they're a form of foreign policy, then maybe they're more in the president's. And that's very interesting, because also at the same time, India, which Trump put a very high tariff on, Narendra Modi went to meet with Xi Jinping, the premier of China, and the media picked up on that as, well, look at this, Trump's tariff policy is falling apart. He's brought India and China, the two biggest countries in the world, together. I think that was a lot of noise. The truth was that Modi has his own internal political issues to deal with. He cannot appear as too cowing to Trump. It actually reflects that the European leaders are so weak that their people see them for who they are, which is very weak.
But in saying that, you're admitting that it is the fault of the tariffs that this happened.
Yes, it is. But my point is that I don't think, China backs Pakistan up a lot. China is not India's friend, right?
But that's the fear, is that this signals that maybe they will be.
I understand, but the point is, you can't discount the many differences China and India have. Yes, the point is, Narendra Modi cannot look as if he's just bowing to Trump's demands.
Saying
right?
They're not going to be friends. It's just political posturing.
Right. He needs to show that, look, I have leverage. I don't have to just listen to the Americans. I'm sort of refracting that off the Europeans, who just look silly. They just go and bow and accept whatever Trump says about them. Whereas for Modi, he can't do that for his own domestic audience in India that doesn't like to see India, bowed, and brought to its knees. Now, does that mean that suddenly India is now best friends with China? Again, China, which works closely with Pakistan, China, which has had wars with India in the past. It's not that. I don't think conferences, people talk, they take pictures, and then they move on.
I hear what you're saying. I think, but if it would come to be, I think that would be horrifying.
If anything, Narendra Modi can see now that if this court is going to strike down Trump's tariffs, he doesn't have to fear Trump so much.
Yeah, I kind of do hope that the court, I think it's not constitutional, but also I think politically it's not good. Economically, it's not good. I think the tariffs have always been about Trump feeling powerful, and that's not a good thing and not necessary for us to bear the burden of Trump's ego. I don't think it's ever been about manufacturing. Job numbers reports came out this morning. Jobs are down significantly. This is not helping bring any jobs back to the United States. Jobs are not coming back, especially now. We're about to have another huge industry shakeup with AI. We're not getting manufacturing jobs from the 70s back in the United States. That's not happening. So I think this has always been about Trump showing that he could dominate on the world stage and dunk on all these countries. And I think that's not good. And we're seeing the effects of that. And I hope you're right. I do think, like you said, there is a huge divide between China and India. But
India has also not been afraid of cozying up to China in some capacity. They've been ambivalent towards cozying up to the US for that reason, that they don't want to show that they're completely Western or anti-China. They want to play their cards well, and it's important that they do feel more closely aligned to the United States because, as you said, they're a massive country and economically important, and militarily in terms of strategic positions very important in the region, especially if China encroaches on Taiwan. We will need allies in India to help
Right.
us.
I mean, you're right. There's obviously something to be concerned about. I think we just call it a day now. But before we do that, there's one last thing we want to
Yeah.
address, which we really appreciate our listener emails. And this time we have another email from Lord Grantley in England. And he asks, I'm not going to read his whole email because it was a longer email, but just in the context of the shooting in Minnesota that the news did not really follow up on, he wants to know about the Second Amendment and the gun laws in America. He writes here, for us Europeans, the concept of carrying arms is very alien, and we need a deeper understanding into the original motivation and how it can still be justified in 2025. So I think this would require a longer discussion, and maybe we will have a time that we discuss the Second Amendment. Obviously, in America, that's very important. Europeans rightly don't necessarily understand that. We can say that, obviously, the legacy of the Second Amendment is this legacy of the armed militia, right? The patriots during the American Revolution wanted their right to their arms, and the British would show up and take and sort of put down these militias.
I mean, it's very important that what's credited as the first battle in the Revolutionary War is Lexington and Concord. What was at Lexington and Concord? It was a military garrison that the British were trying to take over, and the resistance of the revolutionaries were the first shots of the Revolutionary War.
Right. I think what people will point out is that those were sort of, they may not have been federal guns, but they were at least a local assortment of guns. And whereas in America, you could say that the Second Amendment has morphed in sort of an individual right to a gun.
Yeah.
Which is what I think Europeans look at in a strange way.
Right. And I think it's more than just that. I think the other side of the argument is clearly it made sense then when militia armies were important in an actual battlefield. And I once heard a comedian, I think his name was Neil Brennan, he was mocking the NRA activists. So he said, you know what we should do? We should set up every year, we should have the NRA games, and it'll be the NRA people versus the American military. The joke was like, so you have these guys show up with their rifles and their shotguns and their handguns, and the Marine comes with the super highly intelligent drone and drops a bomb and it's over. So the joke is, you don't need a militia anymore. So what is the need to bear arms? And that is where a lot of the criticism comes from the left side, which is the only thing the guns are doing at this point is creating chaos in the streets and school shootings. And I think what you're getting across is very important, that it's not just about whether there's a practical militia in place, but that the American psyche is born in the idea of revolting against tyranny. That is how America came into being. The idea that there are natural rights, and those natural rights were encroached upon by the British, which is the definition of tyranny, and that the only way to prevent against that is through the individual right to stand up for yourself. And that is represented in the symbol of the gun. And so I think more important than whether you actually have a gun or not, and you could talk about, it's still important to prevent against intruders coming into your home, and there are other practical utilitarian benefits to having a firearm. At the end of the day, to me at least, it is a symbol of the idea of what America is. That doesn't mean, oh, the symbol of America is violence or bloodshed. That's not at all what I'm saying. It's actually the opposite, which is that the symbol of America is human rights as embedded in the idea of natural rights, and that people are worthy of having those rights protected. That is the social contract of John Locke that gives our government the legitimacy to rule over the citizens. Without that idea, we don't believe in a government as having the mark of heaven. You know, the seat of government comes from God is not the American conception of government. The American conception of rights is that God embeds rights in man, and that right is protected by the government. So to me is why the symbol of the gun, again, it's really showing the inversion of the English imperialism and the American individualism, and bringing that to real life in a way that if you would take away everybody's guns, it would signal that we don't believe in those things anymore that make America what it is as a place of a
Right.
government that believes in the idea
I
of
think
natural rights.
right. I want to put some context and I'll be a bit of a devil's advocate because obviously from a European perspective, I think that in some ways in the European perspective, there isn't that focus on individual liberty and that focus on sort of the state being a creation of people surrendering their rights, their God-given rights to the state. It's actually, if let's say in France, right, that it's a creation of the people, it's a creation of the nation, the French Republic. It's a nation, and there isn't that element on individual liberty. And that's why people look on, okay, you want to say that local towns have a right to their own sort of independence. Maybe that's an element of federalism, but the idea that each individual needs on his own. And again, like you said, it's based in the history of John Locke. But I guess I'm just pointing out John Locke, he wasn't Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who viewed the will of the people as a much more collective phenomenon as opposed to an individual one.
Well, that's the difference between republics and democracies. And I think Rousseau was more of a populist. And I don't
Right.
think he's the model of American democracy. I mean, we're
He's
not a
not. You're right.
republic. We're not a republic.
But
We have an electoral college.
and I will just add another point, which is that technically speaking, legally, another reason why the right to bear arms has morphed into basically this individual right away from just simply the idea of a militia is because the Bill of Rights are a restriction on government. So they're a restriction on government from infringing on both, states' rights, but also on states and the federal government's right to infringe on people. So
exactly.
that's why, even if you want to argue that this originated in sort of a collective right to municipalities having a right to their own militia, has also morphed into, even small municipalities not having the right to, being restricted from coming and infringing on people's individual rights, whether it's the right to free speech or the right to bear arms. And I think if you think about it, in this age of federalism, when the federal government is much more powerful than the states today, state power has been very centralized in DC. It's understandable that the Bill of Rights that are granted to us in the Bill of Rights the state needs to be held back from infringing on those rights because there no longer are these strong municipalities that, you're going to have the Albany militia. I mean, give me a break. The Albany militia is not. The Albany militia is just calling up the DC militia to ask them what to do. So this vestige of resistance to federal power and federal overreach has now been recentered in the individual, which is why this right is now
exactly. And I think what I like the way you put it is that I don't necessarily see it as part of natural rights. This is what I was trying to say. It's not that the Constitution is declaring part of natural rights is man's right to own a firearm. I don't think that's what it's saying. It's saying because man has natural rights, the ability of the government to encroach on those rights is limited. And that's what I was trying to say, that there's an inversion from the monarchy to the individual. And that's what America is. And so any way that the government is going to encroach on you needs justification. The idea of the gun is that you stand up for your individualism in the face of government overreach, that the government does not have the ability to do as it pleases without your permission. You need to grant the government permission in order to do something. And that is what I was, again, trying to say about the social contract's legacy. Does that mean people should go into the White House and shoot things and legislators? They don't know. I'm not saying that. But my point is, again, it's representative as a symbol. And going back to our earlier conversation, as somebody who cares about culture, I think that symbols are actually very important. And it kind of in a Jungian psychological way, even if you don't necessarily see it consciously, there's this subconscious feeling of the symbol represents something. And to me, again, what it's representing is that the government does not get to act without consent.
I need to push back slightly and give a bit of the European perspective. In America, say, look at the Europeans, they're all surrendering their power to the EU. They have no individual rights. They have nothing. Even their countries are losing rights. Obviously, there's truth to that. On the other hand, the Europeans look at America and they see people shooting each other and this violence in the street. And they say, hey, you don't understand that there's a collective here and people can work together. And if you sort of believe in there's a strong sort of communal element in European countries, the German state, the French state, the Italian state, that can come and improve the situation. And often when when history of Europe has been the history of unification. Unification of Italy brought a lot of good things to the Italian people. It removed Catholic overreach. It removed petty fighting. The unification of Germany. These were good things in European history, and they don't come with that skepticism that we do to this date. I had to do that just to push back a bit, Josh, because we can't just have a American sounding board here,
Right. So I think that's a different argument, though, that, I'm not even trying to make. To me, the idea that mass shootings are fixed by taking guns away is not a good argument, because oftentimes people who obtain guns,
They got them
there's a lot of
illegally.
underlying issues that are why they're committing the mass shootings. And a lot of times they do obtain them legally in some of the most restrictive states. And so even if we would take away all of the guns in the United States, which is such wishful thinking and actually impossible, it's more impossible than wiping Israel off the map and having all the Jews go back to Poland. Even if that were to happen, I think that if there are underlying issues that you haven't addressed, so it could be mental health, it could be something about, again, maybe it is part of this American individualism or the angst of the Americans, or the American whatever. You could come up with different rationales for why mass shootings happen. I'm not going to give one. But my point is, if you don't address the fundamental underlying issues, you're putting a Band-Aid on something but not fixing the actual
and you
root
could
cause.
understand how legally speaking, once you remove one of the Bill of Rights, I mean, who's to say you're not going to remove the next one? It's really,
Well, that for sure. So there's a slippery slope argument.
crazy.
Right, exactly. But I think it's very important that, I think, because a lot of left-wing pundits get a lot of sympathy for that view of, well, yes, there were all these underlying issues, but there wouldn't have been violence at the end of the day if this person didn't have a gun. And I just think that's not true. There are other ways to carry out violence, and there are psychotic, evil people in the world. And it could be maybe America has more. I don't know. But I don't think it's only because of weapons that bad things happen in America. A lot of it does have to do with individualism, and a lot of it has to do with the breakdown of communities. I mean, there's an interesting history of the rise of serial killers in the 70s. And by the way, not happening in other countries, and they weren't using firearms. They were choking people and breaking into their homes,
That's
strangling.
another interesting cultural. Maybe
Yeah, like that was really never
we
a
have-
thing. I mean,
yeah.
kidnapped children, a huge phenomenon
These are
starting
all
in the
topics
70s.
we should discuss, Josh, because we focus on these things, but the truth is, Josh is an expert on a wide variety of topics.
I'm
No
not.
doubt, he's going to give us a Hannibal Lecter lecture about how Hannibal Lecter's influence on the political climate.
Well, he's a reflection of, again, that 70s culture of the BTK and
What's
all of
BTK?
these. There was this guy, I think he was in Wichita, who he was a serial killer it was bind, torture, and kill. He was a psychopath, and he never shot a person. He strangled them with Ziploc bags and plastic bags. He would break into their homes, and he was a masochist and an evil man. What made it so shocking was, I think it was about the 1970s, and it was in one of these sleepy towns where the way it's portrayed on TV and the way it felt at the time was that nothing could harm us, that we're not in the big city. There's not going to be crime. There's no bank robberies. We're a nice, wholesome place to live with. You could leave your door unlocked. That was the culture in suburbia and Americana before these sort of things started to creep up. And then all of a sudden, you had these mass serial kill, and then you had Ted Bundy and all of these, and Son of Sam. I mean, Son of Sam is different because he was more of a city serial killer, but these areas of suburban America where you wouldn't expect things to happen this way.
This is all John Locke's fault. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't know why.
He defended the individual right to bear arms. But I guess, like you're saying,
no, these people weren't shooting anybody. They were
Right, they were
hanging them.
restrained, right.
I mean, they were, and again, it was a lot of sexual
Josh, I really think
acts
we
of
need
violence
to,
that took place. And
we definitely need to
and,
devote an episode to this, because I
it's
think
a
you
very
have a lot of
interesting
insight.
case study.
I think it reflects the darker side of the American.
I
that
agree.
comes sometimes.
I do agree with that, and so that's kind of my point. That, like, oh, look, America has all this gun violence. That means guns are the problem. And
Maybe Americans are just messed up.
Yeah,
Like,
I really.
they try to frame it in legal terminology that, oh, well, it's actually a Bill of Rights, but really it's just they're deeply disturbed people
Or at least there's something. I'm not.
they're
giving it-
untethered from their European roots, where
No, or there's
order
something in the American
culture
psyche for somebody who has psychological trauma or major psychological issues, like, again, severe.
Josh, we cannot give away
issues
too much of this episode right now. I think we have to call it a day, because this is another episode.
I mean, this is why I've never seen a psychological documentary of serial killers besides the serial killers in America. Every true crime
sure there
Netflix
are
documentary is about an American serial killer, and now you have the Gilligan Beach.
Josh, you're
Uh,
giving it all
uh,
away. We're going to make a topic about this
Yeah,
and the
okay,
Second
so
Amendment somehow.
there's
right,
a
everyone.
lot in the American psyche to construct
analyze.
and analyze, and we'll get to it one day if you keep listening. And this is why you listen to the Responsive podcast, because we're not just giving you the news, we're giving you the
We're
news.
giving-
And all right, anyway,
All right.
it was great chatting as always, and looking forward to the next episode. Thanks everyone
Thank
for
you, everyone.
tuning in.